for sure we sell cars today where we know the buyer's never gonna drive that car. You know, on a racetrack, nobody tells you off for going too fast. Nobody tells you off for trying to push the limits. So you ask a child to name a racing car brand or name a fast car, it's a Ferrari. When you reach the very high levels of perfection, you render something almost useless. It's not the greatest car, it's not the best car. I have been lucky enough to drive them on racetracks and I don't particularly enjoy it. And he got quite upset with me. He said, no, you mustn't do that.
So hi Harvey, thanks for coming along. Before we kind of get into a little bit about collecting cars, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you'll find your way into it.
Thanks, Aaron. Good to see you, mate. I spent my whole career in cars, but it's not something that was planned. I grew up loving cars. I grew up loving racing. I used to grow up, and I remember being a young kid, and I'd go to my granny's house and play with my dad's toy cars, probably dinky cars or corgi cars or whatever. And I remember I guess I spent a lot of school holidays with my grandparents. I guess my parents were at work. I remember having a book, I think it was called Ultimate Cars, and I would trace the cars in the book. So I guess I've always had a bit of a fascination with cars, but I wouldn't say my parents that they like cars, but I wasn't surrounded by certainly not classic cars when I was a kid, but I guess there was always an innate interest. And I do remember when I was a bit older, again, I think I was spending the day with my grandparents, and they'd organised that we were going to go to Elstree Aerodrome. We're going to go see planes taking off and landing. I remember when my dad picked me up, my grandmother said, yeah, well, he sort of enjoyed lunch, and then we lost him and we found him in the car park looking at a TVR in the car park. So I guess there's one of those things that you just have an attraction to. And then at school, I was into music and I was into playing the drums. So I thought I was going to be a drummer when I left school. And so I think I asked Dad if I could have a new drum kit, and he said, not unless you pay for it. I said, oh, really? He said, yeah, no, you should get a job. So one summer holiday, I thought, right, what do I enjoy that I could potentially get a job in? And so I wrote a load of letters to some car companies, and one of them offered me some work experience for that summer in the workshop. I sort of did that. I was 16 at the time. It was after GCSEs. Went back to school, and all my mates sort of couldn't quite believe that I'd spent my summer in a workshop and they'd spent their summer on the beach somewhere sort of sexy and romantic. So I thought I'd up the ante for the next year, and I wrote some more letters back saying, hey, did my mechanical work experience, but I think I'd be better suited to a life in the office. Maybe I could do sales. And the same company wrote back maybe 3 months later. They wrote back and said, okay, sure. It's a family business. My 2 sons run the sales department. Why don't you come and help them out with the filing? So I went back excited to do filing. And I ended up selling a BMW 507 for £515,000 before I went back to school to complete my A-levels. And then I really had the bug. And I couldn't tell you whether I had the bug for cars, or whether it was the bug for doing deals, maybe, or maybe it's a combination of the pair. But then I had this idea I was going to go to uni. So I took a gap year. I was going to work for 6 months, go traveling for 6 months, go to university. But inevitably didn't go traveling and didn't go to university. And I stayed at that job for 13 years. And only left this summer to start my new role as director of private sales at RM Sotheby's.
Have you still got a thing for the first car you sold?
No, because I actually sold 2 cars that summer holiday, and the first one was not a highlight of my career. So,
okay.
So no.
And the second?
The second one was a great car. Yeah. Yeah. I've got a slight soft spot for those cars.
Nice. So what is it that makes a car go from being a car to being a collector's piece?
It's a great question. And when you bump into somebody, if I bump into somebody in a bar or something, and they get asking me, what's the most expensive car you've sold? And you say, £7-8 million. You know, they fall off their chair. They say, what do you mean? How can a car be so expensive? But if they ask the same person, what's the most expensive painting you'd sold, and somebody said 8 million, I don't think people would be so surprised by that. So I think there's a strange, or I would say almost unique aspect about motor cars, where you have a blurring of the line between a genuine A to B transport, which could be, let's say, a BMW 3 Series. People buy a BMW 3 Series because they want to get their kids to school and they want to drive to work.
Yeah.
Then that goes up a little bit into a BMW M3, which becomes maybe a little bit about going to work, but actually it's a bit more about the thrill of driving and the enjoyment of it. And then that grows and grows and grows until at the very other end of the spectrum, you have, for sure, we sell cars today where we know the buyer's never gonna drive that car. So you sort of have everything in between. So it's a really hard thing to pick on what it is that makes a car go from being a mode of transport to being something collectible. I'm sure it's a combination of the styling, often the noise, often collectability, and of course the other thing is you've also got an element of sport tied into that as well.
Yeah.
Whether that's a racing car or a rally car or it's a road car that was a Senna edition or a Johnny Cecotto edition, where they're harking back to its racing cousins. So I think all of that stuff's wrapped up in one.
That's really interesting. So in last month we spoke to Mark Smith. He's the medal man from Antiques Roadshow, and we talked about the fact that for medals there is a almost exaggerated effect within the collectibles world, that it's almost entirely about the story behind it. If you don't know the man behind the medal and the story of how that man won the medal itself is almost valueless. It's just a hunk of metal. Are there parallels with cars, with motorsport, where there's certain examples that spring to mind where it's more about the story that's driving the value than it is about the car itself?
Yeah, sure. So if we think about, let's take a Michael Schumacher era Formula One car. I think hopefully most of our audience will know who Michael Schumacher is. So Schumacher won 7 world championships. He won 5 of them driving for Ferrari. He drove for Ferrari for a lot longer than that, and there were barren years at the beginning where there were no championships.
Yeah.
So if we take, for example, 2003, that's a vintage Schumacher year.
Okay.
If you take let's say there were, and I'm guessing now, let's say there are 7 or 8 cars that were used by Ferrari in that period. A Schumacher, and I think I'm right in thinking that year, one of those cars he won 5 races in.
And that's unusual?
That'd be unusual. I think there's a handful of cars he would have won five races in. There's one car he won 7 races in. That car would be, let's say, $15 to $20 million. There'll be another one of those half a dozen cars, for example, which will be, in terms of its DNA, in terms of its physical nuts and bolts, identical to our $15 to $20 million car.
Yeah.
But if this car was driven perhaps just in testing, perhaps it's only worth $2 million.
Yeah.
So the gap is ginormous.
And so with that, if we look at the most sought after or the highest value cars, like true icons, what kind of has to be in place to make it, again, go from that step from being collectible to being that car that breaks the 70, 80, 100 million pound barrier?
Again, I'd use a sporting analogy. If you think about, and I was having actually a great example, I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday about Valentino Rossi. If you go into the pub and you find some random people and you say, hey, name me a MotoGP rider, I'd like to think a lot of them would know who Valentino Rossi is, in the same sense that a lot of people would know who Michael Schumacher or Hamilton, or in tennis it could be Federer. Those guys almost seem to transcend their sport. And I think it's the same with cars. And I'm not talking about necessarily Formula One drivers. I'm talking about if you showed a random group of people an Aston Martin DB5, even if they knew nothing about cars, they might not know it's a DB5, but they would probably say, "Oh, that's the Bond Aston Martin."
Yeah.
300 SL Gullwing. People would they might not name it as a 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, but they would recognize the shape, and it'd be the same for an F40. It would certainly be the same for an E-Type.
Yeah.
So those cars, if you like, transcend the car enthusiast in the same way that Roger Federer would transcend the tennis enthusiasts. And that level of iconicity, I think, is when you start to enter. The sort of the stratosphere, if you like, of value. So it's no surprise to me that the most valuable car ever sold, we sold at auction over a year ago, the 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupes, kind of the original, the prototype Goldwing Mercedes. There's a reason why that car would be right at the top of the value ladder.
And the story behind that being that it's named as such because he drove it. He kind of almost commuted in it for a while, didn't he?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, and then you can extrapolate that to, generally speaking, a Ferrari will be worth more than any other equivalent car if you had the same DNA, the same racing history, but one was a Ferrari, one was a Maserati, one was an Aston Martin. The Ferrari would likely be worth 2 or 3 times the value of the other brands. And that again comes back to, you ask a child to name a racing car brand or name a fast car, it's a Ferrari. People grow up, they want to own a Ferrari. They don't necessarily want to own an Aston Martin. They might, but Ferrari is the iconic brand.
Yeah. And what's that? So that's individual cars. What's it doesn't even need to be based on value, but the most interest in your favorite collection of cars, a theme that someone's chosen to build out their collection and spend their money.
In the past, in the 50s or 60s or 70s, you had a lot more what I would call real true collectors. People that would want to have one of everything, or they'd want to have a Ferrari from every year, or a series of race winners.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, I find a lot more of our clients, which we call collectors, maybe are less traditional collectors, and they're more just enthusiasts. They buy what they want in that moment. Oh, I fancy having one of those because I can see a way that would fit into my lifestyle, or I could see a way to enjoy that with my kids or with my pals, or maybe they've just taken up racing and they can see that to do the Goodwood Revival, they need to buy a car to go and do that race. So we see a lot less of that rather than collecting. But there are some phenomenal collections out there, particularly for my passion, particularly based about racing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few collections I've been to where somebody's gone about only buying cars that have either won Le Mans, won their class, or finished in the top 3.
Okay.
And
so proper pedigree.
Yeah.
Okay. Really interesting that you talk about the nature of collecting changing. So what do you think is driving the change from wanting to complete a series or a theme to almost having a more practical element to it of allowing me to access a certain thing or enjoying this in the current moment?
I think it is an urge to use these cars.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether we see that across the spectrum of collecting. I guess the unique thing about cars, unlike wine's a great example, that can only be about collecting, because by enjoying the asset you clearly destroy its value. I think with cars we have this wonderful gift, if you like, to be able to not only collect them but also use them. Sure, we can show them but that's in the same sense you might show a painting, but we can drive them, and in some cases we can race them. So I think that's something quite unique about the hobby of collecting cars, is there's the ability to drive them. So then I think it becomes down to, what do you want to do? Do you want to go and do the Pebble Beach Concorde Elegance, in which case you need to buy, perhaps you want to buy an old Rolls Royce or a pre-war car to go and do that, or do you want to go and, like I said, race at the Goodwood Revival, or do you want to take 3 mates for Sunday lunch in a big Bentley? So suddenly it becomes a lot more about how they fit within your lifestyle.
It's really interesting, because I spoke to somebody a while ago who they were selling a GTO, and the person who'd owned it previously used to let a German Shepherd, I think it was a German Shepherd, I can't remember the exact, but on the passenger seat. And it's this car that is iconic, out of almost everybody's reach, but when they used it, they had a dog sat on the passenger seat, and it's something you couldn't possibly imagine happening to something that is so vastly expensive, but to them they were using it, they were enjoying it. And is that really, really common, or how often do you now find that people will keep them pristine, not use them, box them away, versus doing what you've just described earlier?
I had a conversation with somebody today about a car, and as dealers you can get really caught up in a quality of restoration, a quality of finish, a quality of perfection, if you like, in the car. But actually, in many instances, when you reach the very high levels of perfection, you render something almost useless, because as soon as you drive the car down the road and you pick up one stone chip, the car's not perfect. So you've spoilt maybe what you strive so hard to get. And I used to find that a lot in the old job, where you'd restore a car for somebody. you'd make it perfect, you deliver it to them, and they'd never drive it, because it's a bit like, and I used to be terrible for going out and buying a jacket or a new pair of shoes. I'm not wearing them until a special occasion came along. Until one day, and this is quite an interesting story. Until one day, I was fairly young, and a group of mates of mine, we went to a vineyard in France. We did the whole tour, and they stitched me up. They said, "Oh, we're going to buy loads of wine. We're going to buy cases and cases of this special wine." So anyway, they obviously knew me too well. And at the end of the tour, the guy goes, "Right, so who's going to buy some wine?" So my hand goes straight up. "Sure, I'll have a case of the wine." And I thought my mates would all sort of buy a case too. And I was only really doing it because I thought that's what was going to happen. And he went, "Oh, okay." And then all my mates maybe bought a half bottle or something. And the vineyard owner saw what had happened and had a giggle to himself. And he said, "Oh, look," he said, "I tell you what, 2003 or whatever it was my grandfather's favorite year. We don't have much left, so we don't sell them anymore. But since you've been a good sport and you're not backing out, I'm going to give you a bottle of this wine. You can't buy it, and it's for being a good sport." So I said, "Oh, okay, fine, great." And I said to him, "Oh, brilliant. I'll save it for a really special occasion." And he got quite upset with me. He said, No. You mustn't do that." I said, "Okay, what do you mean?" He said, "You should drink it on a Tuesday evening in February when nothing remarkable has happened all day, because then you'll make this unremarkable Tuesday a remarkable evening." And I thought about it, and I've tried to allow that to change the way that I think about cars, but also other stuff. If you go and buy a really nice pair of shoes, wear them on a mundane day, and it makes it all quite exciting. It's a nice thing. And I think that does. He was quite right about the wine, and I think it does apply to cars even more so. If you and you hear stories of Nick Mason taking his kids to school in the 250 GTO. If you go and do something every day in something very special, it turns an everyday mundane, event or activity into something really quite special. And that could be whether you're commuting to work, whether you're taking the kids to school, picking up a pint of milk, whatever it is. And I think special cars have an ability to turn the mundane into something extraordinary. And I think I would encourage my clients and my friends and collectors to do more of that. And it's a battle, because we are talking about valuable assets. We are talking about an element of faff. Your everyday car is likely sat outside, and the other car is probably inside on charge. But if you can get into a habit of doing that, I think it's a great way to enjoy one's collection.
And it's the reference to incredible, individual, unique cars, or creating a special experience. Reminds me, I popped to see you a while ago, and the place where you're working at the time happened to have a James Bond replica of a DB5, and it had all of these bells and whistles. It had the phone in the car. It had the oil spray out the back, which sprayed water, which I think you found out by accident, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And it seems to resonate. It seems to have similarities when you look at something like that with the James Bond DB5 with people who might not have the multi-millions. They maybe have 50, they maybe have 75 pounds, and they might buy a small model, a replica. Have you ever considered whether there's a kind of crossover in the things that people are looking for when they're buying a replica of these incredible cars that you get to deal with day to day, versus those who can actually afford to go out and acquire them?
Yeah, I think so. I think at the end of the day, I think probably now's a good time to caveat the fact that cars have been a very good investment. And I think when something's a very good investment, as good a news story as that is, it sometimes clouds the almost childish desire of buying exactly what you want. If somebody loves cars, and one car's going up in value and one car's going down in value, naturally they're going to buy the car that's going up in value. Mm-hmm. Now that investment trajectory is maybe not completely leveled off, but it's slowed a little bit, and it's certainly not quite the sort of doubling year on year than it was at one point. People start to think a little bit more with their heart and less with their brain. Mm-hmm. And when people start to do that, then absolutely you end up exactly back at what you're talking about. You end up exactly back at a 7 or 8 year old choosing which toy car I wanted to play with, and the reasons for that are very much heartfelt. They're very much emotional. Mm-hmm. So I'm enjoying where the market is now in as a dealer and as a specialist, if you like, being able to give a perspective on growth, on the market situation, on quality, on what's a good buy and what's not a good buy. But I'm enjoying now there being maybe a little bit more passion, a little bit more emotion in the purchases than there were perhaps 5 to 10 years ago when a lot of people were thinking far more speculatively than they were passionately, if that makes sense.
Interesting. And so if that market is possibly plateauing, is there anything that you look at now that you think will book that trend? Anything that you think is undervalued or might outperform the index?
Yeah, an F40 has been the one car that the car market follows a supply and demand sort of trajectory like any market would. And that generally means with cars you have flurries when a car will shoot up in value because nobody wants to sell, but perhaps there's 5 guys that want to buy. So suddenly you have a big shift in the dynamic and they'll shoot up in value. And then suddenly, once a car's gone from 500 grand to £1 million, the guys that bought at 500 grand suddenly think, well, I'll sell. So suddenly a few more come on the market and you have a leveling off as the supply and demand ebbs and flows. An F40 is one of those cars that hasn't really ebbed and flowed so much. It's actually followed a pretty straight trajectory upwards. For me, an F40 is a real favourite, and for me that's a car that really transcends classic car and supercar. It's the last car that Enzo Ferrari oversaw before he passed away in 1988. So that car to me has a real uber legendary status. So that car I think will just continue to appreciate.
And it almost, when you think of the 80s, you think of that car. And when you think of that car, you think of the 80s. It's almost like it captures that decade almost, somehow.
Yeah, and I was speaking to somebody the other day about it, who's a very passionate Italian, and he told the story of that car in his eyes as a child growing up in the 80s and 90s, and what that car epitomized in his eyes, and he's probably right. A time when Italy was I think he said it was the 6th biggest economy in the world. Their football team was amazing. Their industry was amazing. Their fashion labels were the best in the world. Their food was always been the best in the world. And now they had the best car in the world. It's like, yeah, cars can capture a period in time like that so well.
Building a collection takes a lifetime of passion and dedication. When the time comes to pass it on, whether it's your personal collection or one you've inherited, how can you ensure it finds someone who will treasure it as much as you do? And how can you be certain it achieves its full value? For almost 2 centuries, Stanley, Gibbons and Baldwins have been trusted by collectors worldwide to auction their items, including stamps, coins, medals and trading cards. With free valuations, live auctions in central London and world-renowned expertise, SGB makes the process seamless and rewarding. Their stunning catalogues and global audience ensure that your collection is always beautifully showcased to passionate bidders hunting for your items. Start your auction journey today by submitting a free valuation request at sgbaldwins.com. The Victoria Cross is Britain's highest military decoration, awarded for exceptional bravery in the face of the enemy. Join Mark Smith, the esteemed medal and militaria expert, often featuring on BBC's Antiques Roadshow, as he brings history to life in his captivating live tour. Recognised globally as a leading authority on the Victoria Cross, Mark delves into its origins, dispels enduring myths, and shares riveting tales of extraordinary heroes. Don't miss this unforgettable journey through courage and sacrifice. Secure your tickets now at marksmithmedals.com. So would that be, if you were to pick the greatest car ever made, in your opinion, is that it, or is there another competitor?
It's not the greatest car. It's not the best car. It's not the fastest car around a racetrack. In fact, I have been lucky enough to drive them on racetracks. I don't particularly enjoy it, and it's deeply flawed. But it's probably the car I would go to first if you said, look, you got to buy one car to have forever. It's probably the car I'd go to. And actually, strangely, it's because it's flawed. In the same way that, careful how I put this maybe, in the same way that there are certain girlfriends that might be deeply flawed, but on the basis that you're not driving your F40 to work every day, you're only driving it once a month. Sometimes having something that's flawed brings out huge amounts of character. So when you do drive your F40, you forgive the fact that it doesn't actually stop very well. and the water comes in through the windows, and it has no radio, and although it has aircon, it's pretty ineffective, and it's very low, so you can't go. You forgive all the foibles, because the thing that it's really good at, which is giving you goosebumps, making you feel alive, making you feel excited, it's very good at.
So the perfect car by virtue of its imperfections.
Correct.
Is it becoming more difficult to get into car collecting?
I think on the whole it is. There's an awful lot more barriers generally to petrol car usage than there has been, certainly in my 13, 14, 15 years in the industry. Post Brexit, we've got a taxation block, if you like, between moving cars, certainly if they're under 30 years old, from the EU into the UK. When I was younger, we used to buy modern Ferraris in left-hand drive from Europe. We'd bring them in when the currency was right and would sell them, and then when that guy was finished with them, he could sell them back to Europe. You can't do that anymore. So that's without shadow of a doubt a limitation. At the grassroots level, you've got a big problem with the ultra low emission zone in London here, where young guys living in London that want to buy an entry level classic car, which likely would be something from the 1990s, maybe it's a Land Rover Defender or something similar. They can't do it. It's just not feasible.
Yeah,
it's just not feasible. So that's a real problem, because if you take a big cross section of my friends who are, let's say, in their early 30s that are at the age now where, I don't know, they've got a decent job, maybe they've finally got a bit of spare cash to go and indulge their hobby, they're likely living in London. Maybe by the time they move maybe they move out to the countryside when they have a couple of kids, well, then they're probably not going to have the freedom to be allowed to go and have a classic car, because they might need to have a more practical family wagon. So I think that's really alarming for me. And I'd love to see some sort of dispensation for classic cars, newer classic cars from, because at the end of the day, all of this comes back to childhood. So guys my age want to buy cars from the 90s because they're retro.
Yeah.
They're not really necessarily wanting to buy cars from the 50s or 60s. So I think that's quite alarming. There's obviously a value point as well. There's a maintenance point. It's quite hard to maintain a classic car. There's a physical, monetary cost to servicing it, taxing it, MOTing it, insuring it, which does make it difficult.
And you mentioned right at the beginning of that about the challenges with petrol cars with internal combustion engines. So what challenges might the growth of electric cars present for the hobby, for collecting?
I used to worry that that there would be a hatred of the internal combustion engine, and there definitely was at one point. There definitely was a point where driving a petrol car, or me telling somebody that my hobby is going racing and driving around in circles in the weekend, would have been really frowned upon. That seems to have died away as an anti-car thing, because I think people have probably realised that keeping a classic car on the road is actually far better for the environment than going and mining the minerals required to make a new Tesla battery.
There's a period of time, wasn't there, where you couldn't move for a photo of a celebrity being accidentally caught with a Prius. It was really, really common for a short period of time, and that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Yeah, so that seems to have died off. For sure, the petrol car is going to die out, and I think for sure the thrill of driving on a day-to-day basis will die, whether that comes through autonomous driverless cars, whether that just becomes through new cars having speed limit control. They're going to steer themselves. The cruise controls are getting so sophisticated that now actually, even my 5-year-old Range Rover can sit on the motorway with its radar control. If there's an accident ahead, it will slow down, it will stop, it will come to a halt, we'll sit there until the car in front rolls away, and it will roll away and follow it. I don't have to touch the pedals. So I think the thrill of actually driving every day is going to become less and less and less.
Do you think that'll drive people into a racing hobby? Because you can't experience that in any other way possible on your day-to-day commute.
Absolutely. On a racetrack, nobody tells you off for going too fast. Nobody tells you off for trying to push the limits. Nobody tells you off for pushing the boundaries. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to drive people towards racing at a high level. Fortunately, it's expensive, but absolutely it will. And I think it will probably push people into the older cars, where, whilst they're an awful lot less practical, they're an awful lot more engaging. So driving will become like at the beginning of this conversation, I said the funny thing about collecting cars, unlike collecting a painting or wine, is we get to use them and enjoy them in an everyday setting. Increasingly, I believe that's going to split. And people will have their cars as a method of transport and their cars as a method of a hobby. And it'll become quite different.
You'd mentioned previously that you were once gifted a Scalextric replica of a car that was in your possession. I think you were racing at the time.
I think we had bought it. We were in the process of a restoration.
That's it. Yeah.
I think I did an on-track demo with it, but we never raced it. But somebody had, Scalextric had made a model of it. Yeah, it was a 3-litre RSR Porsche.
And so, does a chap who can talk about racing F40s and not particularly enjoying it, and some of the cars that you deal on a day-to-day basis, what do you do when you have a model? Do these models sit on your desk? Do they go in a drawer in the back? Where do they live?
Yeah, I've just moved house and I've just moved office, so they're all currently in storage. But I would like to sort that out and have the idea of having a desk around you with model cars, a model specifically of cars that mean something to you. So either they're cars that you've raced successfully, they're cars you've sold that are a particularly memorable deal, or cars that, my career is punctuated by literally individual motor cars.
Yeah.
Whether it's chassis 0773 250T, the F Ferrari, or whether it's 86 PJ, the Atkins Ronnie Salvadori lightweight E-Type, or whether it's the F40LM chassis 83313, there's these, or 750 Monza or 0502, there's these almost like snapshots of my career that are punctuated by a car. So for me, owning the models of those cars is probably the only way I'm ever going to be able to collect those things back again.
So you're collecting keepsakes based on moments in your career. The other person might have the real thing, but your collection is becoming the items you sold.
Yeah, absolutely. Or raced, or had significant involvement in.
So as a racer, you mentioned somebody earlier on that had built a collection based on Le Mans winners or podium finishers, I think you said. What's your standout experience since you've been in the motoring world? Is it race related?
For sure. I could easily lay my hand on a couple of racing moments. Goodwood Revival winning at Goodwood is very special.
Driving
E-Type, very, very special. But I would say there's other memories that are maybe stronger. Sure, there's walking into completely show-stopping collections. Generally, they happen to be in America, maybe where they have the space to have their cars laid out, which is impressive. But some of the more exciting stuff that I would cherish more is pulling the cars out of places you never thought you were going to pull a car out of. I've pulled a number of cars out of Venezuela, both out of Caracas and out of, really punchy places in the Venezuelan-Colombian border where we knew there was a Ferrari. We knew it had been there for 40 years. We kind of had an idea that the family that raced it in the 50s and 60s still owned it, but we couldn't find a way to get to the family. We tried to get to them through a friend of mine in Venezuela who thought he knew them, and eventually they called us. 3 or 4 years later, they found us.
Why was that particular car worth the effort of hunting down?
Probably wasn't in the end. I think it's the romance of it, and we see time and time again with barn finds and with projects that they sell for more money than they're really worth because there's a romance of it. Mm-hmm. And it brings us back to really cars like stamps, like watches, like coins are just assets. They're just pieces of material. Mm-hmm. But what makes us love them is some sort of emotional connection, some sort of experiential benefit. So I guess I'm talking there about cars that are exciting because there's an experience involved. Mm-hmm. For me, finding those cars, there's a real experiential buzz of finding gold in the riverbed, finding a gem somewhere where you wouldn't think you'd find it. And when we talk about selling these cars or bringing these cars to auction, these cars make more money than they really should do because there's an experiential benefit of somebody buying that project and returning it to its former glory. So I think suddenly then you start thinking about these assets far more, less as a material token and more of a gateway to a set of emotions or an experience that otherwise can't be unlocked.
How do you communicate that to potential buyers at auction? So you'll be running auctions on a regular basis, lots and lots of high value cars, lots of them with their own story. How do you deliver that? How do you extract that passion and that kind of desire to spend such high values on the cars in the bidders?
It's a very, very timely question. So in 4 or 5 weeks ago, I came back from LA where we had a sale we called the junkyard sale. So
right,
Google it. RM Sotheby's The Junkyard. The junkyard is quite literally a junkyard in between Watts and Compton in not a great part of LA.
Yeah.
I mean, quite safe to say, not somewhere you want to be at night. And Rudy Klein was a junk dealer. Quite literally, he would buy crashed or broken exotics. So Porsches, Ferraris, Mercedes, and he'd put them in his junkyard, and sometimes he'd break them for spares, and sometimes he'd leave them as they were. Now, over the course of time, he bought a lot of cars.
How long is that?
We're talking probably from the late 50s into the 80s, maybe.
Okay.
He passed away a short while ago, a few years ago, and his sons own the junkyard and everything within the junkyard. And I'm talking 6 or 7 Porsche 356s piled on top of each other in stacks of 4 or 5 high. The only 300 SL alloy gullwing in factory black, unrestored, unrunning. A 300 SL Roadster with Rudge wheels, one of I think 26 cars with Rudge wheels. You know, on its haunches, suspension collapsed.
Yeah.
You know, and actually, because it's LA, they haven't completely rotted away because it's dry. Mm-hmm. The place is dusty, and when you go in there, it looks like a movie set. It looks like something out of
like Mad Max or something.
Yeah, absolutely. So, some of those cars are worthless in the real world. Some of those cars, by the time you put the effort into restoring them, you spent more than the cars are worth. So, there'd be a write-off if you like. Now, we sold everything there, everything, and we're talking over 100 lots. And I would have thought we would have sold 70% of that stuff for world record prices for something in that condition. The 300 SL alloy gullwing, which would have been the star lot, we sold for in excess of $9 million, which is way more than the last restored car sold for.
Oh, it's just about right. Wow. Okay.
So you asked me a question, how do we go about it? Now, I don't think I'm blowing up my own trumpet here because I wasn't in any way involved in the team that put that together. So it's all praise to them. But the guys did an absolute masterclass in selling the experience, in selling the excitement of it. And for sure, I think the guys that bought those cars knew that they were paying a bit more than they wanted to pay for them. But they bought into the experience. It all comes down to the details. One of the really cool things they did is they took a bonnet off one of the rusted 356s and they laser cut it into little tiny squares. And then they engraved on the squares the junkyard sale and the date. And they sent those out as invites to come to the auction. You know, it's all that attention to detail, the way the room was. And look, actually the 300 SL alloy gullwing is the only black one. It is almost certainly the best in the world when it's restored. And the guy that's bought it knows exactly what he's bought. And when he's finished restoring it, he's going to further enjoy the journey of doing what he wants to do with it, telling the next chapter of that story himself. But for sure, we ought to think of these assets far more, or certainly cars, as far more on the experiential line than just on the hoarding, the pure collecting. And that's why historic races become so popular. That's why tours and rallies and events and shows are so popular. That's why restoration projects so well, because there's an experience associated. So I think the key is to try and continually lock into offering our clients proper experiences.
And if somebody's taken by everything that you're saying, they already have that urge. Maybe they've been out with their grandparents and they've run out to the car park and sat looking at a TVR as well. And so they have that there, and they've got a modest pot of cash, but a desire to start down this road. Where do they look? What's their first step to get into car collecting? What are the kind of the do's and what are the things that avoid like the plague?
I think you'd be well advised to always try and buy the best example that you can. So let's say you've got an arbitrary pot of £20,000.
Yeah.
Rather than stretching yourself to buy maybe a leggy or a tired Series 2 E-Type. I'm not even sure if that would even buy you a Series 2 E-Type. Why don't you actually go and buy the best MGA you can, and then you'll enjoy that because you'll be proud of it, rather than trying to buy something that's maybe a little bit beyond your means at that time, buying a lesser example or a questionable example, because I think that'll spoil and taint your enjoyment.
So the inference being as well, not just to buy something to look at, buy something that you're going to be emotionally tied to, enjoy, actually use.
Yeah, use it. Go to the pub in it. Yeah, use it.
Yeah.
And I think enjoy the community if you can as well. Try and find people to enjoy the hobby with. But yeah, I don't think it's hard to enjoy owning cars like that. I think the key is to use it.
Add to the story.
Yeah. And if you can't afford the car, then you should club up with some mates and you should buy it, 2 or 3s.
Is that quite commonplace?
I think it increasingly is becoming. A pal of mine and we want to buy a Series 1 Land Rover. I've always wanted one. I want to go to the Goodwood Revival in one. I don't need to own that myself.
They're beautiful.
They're
so fantastic. Cool. Yes.
So why should I buy one myself? And why should my pal fancies one? What's the point in us buying one each when we can share the experience? He's got a house, he can keep it out. I said if he stores it, I'll insure it. Why can't you share those experiences? Fractionalize the ownership proposition between some mates, whether it's 2 or 3 of you or 4 of you. Something like a Series 1 Land Rover, I think, is a great car to share the ownership of like that. I'd love to see more of that in the marketplace.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Harvey.